It was raining the day I made the choice I have never told anyone about. Cold, persistent drizzle, the kind that soaks through your uniform and your thoughts. I was in northern Italy then, early spring of '44, part of a small infantry company that had been shuffled from one hill to the next for weeks. Mud was everywhere, under our boots, in our mouths, in the small pack of letters I kept tucked under my jacket. One of those letters, yellowed and brittle even then, had my sister's neat handwriting. I never opened it in front of anyone, but I carried it like a talisman. By the third day of the rain, it was soggy at the edges, and I started to wonder if some things were better left unread. I remember the smell first: wet earth, smoke from a distant skirmish, and the faint tang of blood, not mine. Our unit had been stationed along a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The Germans had the high ground in parts, the way you always hear about in training films, but nothing prepares you for the actual silence after the first shots. We huddled under a line of pines, waiting, our breath steaming in the cold morning air. My close friend, Tommy, was crouched beside me, fiddling with the laces on his boots like he always did when he was nervous. I don't think he realized I noticed. He thought he was hiding his worry. We'd been through Normandy together months before, and in some quiet way, surviving together made us trust each other more than anyone else in that unit. I had my father's watch with me, a silver-faced thing with a cracked crystal. It wasn't much, but when I held it, winding it slowly in the drizzle, I felt a tether to home, to a life that seemed impossible to reach again. The watch ticks on my wrist even now in my memories, reminding me of a time when choices mattered in ways you couldn't see at the moment. That morning, as we scanned the valley below, the orders came down. A small patrol moving ahead to take a farmhouse the Germans were using for observation. The officers framed it as necessary reconnaissance. But I knew, as well as Tommy did, that it meant we might lose men before even firing a shot. That's when the decision I still can't justify began. I saw a chance, a moment that felt small, almost inconsequential at first, to avoid leading men into harm. It wasn't brave. It wasn't heroic. It was cautious, self-preserving, and it scared me more than the thought of shells in the distance. Tommy looked at me, his eyes asking without words, and I hesitated. Hesitation in those moments has a way of echoing louder than bullets. I pretended to check my rifle, to tie my laces tighter, anything to stall. Part of me wanted to step back, let someone else take the lead, let orders play out as written. Another part, the part I despise, wanted the whole patrol to move on and hope no one noticed I'd slowed it down. I can still hear the sound of rain against my helmet, mingling with the low murmur of the men readying themselves. And I can feel the weight of that watch, wet against my wrist, as if it knew what I was about to do. It was a choice that seemed small, even trivial, in the moment, but I didn't understand what that choice would cost until weeks later. Tommy didn't know I hesitated. No one did. And yet, something in his glance that morning made me promise, silently, that I'd protect him, no matter what. I kept the watch close, and I kept my secret. But secrets have a way of outliving their owners. The farmhouse, the patrol, the decision. It all led to something I've carried for the better part of 80 years. Would you have done differently? That's the question I keep asking myself, even now, and I'm not sure I'd want the answer. The rain eased, leaving a pale light in the valley, but the unease didn't lift. It never lifted. Something had begun that morning, a chain of events that would follow me long past the end of the war. Long past the point where anyone could understand the weight of a single, small decision. And the truth, the part I've never told anyone, was waiting, buried beneath mud, letters, and the ticking of that old watch. The morning light was thin, pale gray, barely touching the ridges. The drizzle had stopped, but the ground was slick, sucking at our boots with every step. We moved in silence, Tommy and I at the back of the small patrol, following the sergeant's hand signals. I kept winding the watch in my palm, just enough to hear the faint click of the gear. It was absurd, mechanical reassurance in the middle of a war, but it steadied me. The farmhouse came into view over a rise, isolated, half hidden by budding trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and wavering, and for a moment it looked peaceful, like any house in a quiet American town. But the sergeant whispered through clenched teeth that the men inside had fired on our supply convoy 2 nights before. My stomach knotted. I didn't doubt the report, but I did doubt the price we'd pay for confirming it firsthand. Tommy glanced at me, and I saw the same calculation in his eyes that I was trying to ignore. He was smaller than most, wiry and fast, but his face carried the weight of experience we'd both earned in Normandy. He trusted me. Or maybe he just trusted the rhythm we'd established together. Either way, I couldn't tell him what I was thinking. That every step closer made me question if leading men to that house was right. We crouched behind a low stone wall. The sergeant was already counting in whispers, gesturing for the others to fan out. I looked at the farmhouse again. A single light flickered inside, as if someone were moving about, unaware of us. I imagined the family who might have lived there. A woman bending over a stove, children asleep in their beds. The thought was fleeting, drowned quickly by the weight of the mission. Yet it lingered in the corners of my mind like smoke that won't rise. I caught Tommy adjusting his rifle, the motion nervous. I wanted to say something, some reassurance, but words felt dangerous. We didn't have the luxury of talking about morality or fear. The language of survival was silence, obedience, and the slow, careful breathing that kept our hearts from giving us away. I held the watch to my chest for a moment, trying to convince myself that the ticking meant nothing, that it was just time passing, not a judgment. Then we heard it, a creak of the floorboards inside, subtle, but unmistakable. The sergeant signaled forward. My hands froze around the rifle, and I realized the hesitation I'd felt that morning hadn't gone anywhere. It had only sharpened. I knew with a clarity that terrified me that I could step aside, let someone else take the lead, and in doing so, perhaps change what would happen next. But stepping aside wasn't just a pause. It was a choice that could cost lives. Tommy glanced at me again. I could see the question in his eyes. Are we ready? I couldn't answer it. I swallowed hard and nodded, barely, and we moved forward. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the mud itself were weighing down more than just our boots. By the time we reached the edge of the clearing, I had made a promise. To myself, to Tommy, that I would keep him safe. But promises are fragile in war. And I realized I was holding mine with trembling hands. It was a detail I've never told anyone, not even my wife, that morning, and it has haunted me for decades. I made a small adjustment in our approach, a deviation so slight that the sergeant probably never noticed, but enough to start a chain I couldn't stop. Would you have noticed? Would you have questioned a choice that seemed minor, insignificant even, in the moment? That's the thing about war. Minor choices echo long after the noise has faded. And I didn't understand, not then, what the echo would sound like. The farmhouse door was just ahead. I could see shadows moving inside, faint, human, unaware of the storm approaching on the ridge above us. Storm not of weather, but of decisions made too quietly, too late. And for the first time that day, I realized that the consequences of hesitation might not be the ones I imagined. They could be worse. I glanced at Tommy. His face was pale, but calm enough to make me wonder if he sensed what I couldn't admit. That my choices, however small, were no longer just about surviving. They were about something I wasn't ready to confront. And then the first shot rang out. The first shot cut through the morning air like a jagged line. It wasn't the full roar of battle, not yet. Just a single, sharp report. But it froze us in place. My stomach dropped, and the watch slipped slightly in my hand. Tick, tick. Every second stretching longer than the one before. The farmhouse had come alive with movement, shadows darting behind curtains, the sudden slam of a door. Tommy dropped low beside me, whispering, "What now?" His voice was steady, too steady, and I envied him that. I kept my rifle ready, but my mind was elsewhere. I replayed the small deviation I'd made in our approach, the one nobody noticed. It seemed insignificant at the time. A step to the left, a hesitation in the line, but I realized, with a cold twist in my gut, that it had put us out of the sergeant's intended formation. That shift, that tiny choice, might have changed everything. We huddled behind the wall, the mud sucking at our boots, and I felt the first creeping dread of what obedience and hesitation together could mean. The sergeant was calling orders, sharp, clipped, but I could see the confusion in his eyes too. Men moved hesitantly, unsure if the farmhouse door concealed enemies or innocents. And me, I kept gripping the watch, feeling its weight like a chain around my wrist. There was a window at the corner of the house. Through it, I glimpsed a figure crouching, not aiming, just crouching. The outline of a man, maybe a civilian, or someone too young to be shooting at us. Though in that war, age rarely mattered. My heart thumped. Tommy caught the movement too. We both froze, because what comes after hesitation is always the question. Do you act, or do you wait and hope someone else does? Anonig, so, do you wait and hope someone else does? I can still hear the quiet rustle of leaves, the faint sound of the valley beyond, indifferent to what we were about to do. It's funny, in retrospect, how life seems normal outside the bubble of fear and choices. I thought then that the world would pause for a second, give me time to decide. It didn't. Decisions came fast, consequences faster. The sergeant barked again, louder this time, and we moved. The patrol was stretched thin, tension snapping like a wire underfoot. And then it happened. One of the younger soldiers stumbled, a grunt, a muffled curse, a body hitting mud die. It was only a minor injury, but in that instant, I realized how easily our fate could be changed by a single misstep. And I also realized that my hesitation, my small secret deviation, might have put him in that path. Tommy looked at me, eyes sharp now. He didn't accuse. He didn't question. But the look was enough. Enough to know that in some wordless way, he sensed my role in what had just occurred. And I knew with a dread I've carried since that some part of the truth had slipped between us that morning. Inside the farmhouse, movement increased. Shouts, muffled by the walls, but real and human. And there it was again, that quiet question that had followed me since Normandy. Would you have acted differently? Could you justify hesitation when action mattered? I didn't answer then. I didn't answer for decades. And as the patrol pressed closer to the house, I felt the first pangs of fear that this small deviation, this cautious step, might not just have endangered us, it might have set something irreversibly in motion. Something I would spend a lifetime thinking about, never able to undo. Then the sergeant yelled my name, not Tommy's, mine. And in that moment, I understood that the choice I'd made, silent, hidden, almost invisible, was about to collide with reality. The sergeant's voice cut through the muddled panic like a whip. "Riley, move!" My heart jumped, and the watch slipped from my hand, landing in the mud with a soft, miserable thunk. I scrambled to pick it up, fingers numb, the ticking somehow louder, more insistent, as if it knew I was about to be forced into a truth I'd been avoiding. Tommy's hand landed on my shoulder, steady, grounding, but it couldn't erase the weight of what I'd done. Inside the farmhouse, the air smelled of damp wood and cooking smoke. One of the rooms held a civilian, or someone who looked every bit as afraid as we were. A man, maybe 30, hands raised instinctively, eyes wide, the kind of eyes that see the world tilting and know they have no control. He didn't speak at first, just stared. I wanted to lower my rifle, to say something, anything. But the sergeant was moving us forward, voice sharp, impatient. It was then I noticed the first blood. Not mine, not Tommy's, not anyone in our immediate group, but from the young soldier who had stumbled before. His arm was scraped, muddy, but enough to make him wince. The sergeant barked orders, making us sweep the rooms. I remember thinking with a strange clarity that it wasn't the Germans we were meant to confront first. It was the consequences of my hesitation, creeping up the stairs behind us. Tommy was beside me as we entered the kitchen. The civilian man's hands were trembling. I caught his gaze, and in that moment, I recognized something terrifying. The reflection of fear I'd seen in Normandy, in the eyes of men I thought were enemies, now mirrored back at me from someone who hadn't chosen this war. I couldn't shake the sense that the tiny choice I had made, stepping left, hesitating, had put this man and all of us on a path that might not have been necessary. The sergeant motioned for him to sit. He obeyed immediately, and I saw the small tremble of his shoulders, the silent plead in his posture. I kept the watch in my hand now, as if gripping it could tether me to sanity, or maybe tether him to mercy. It didn't. It never does. Tommy whispered under his breath, "Riley, what if—" But he didn't finish. We both knew the thought. That hesitation, the one I thought harmless, might have allowed him to be exposed, or worse, to force our hand in ways that would haunt us. We had trained for obedience, for action, but we hadn't trained for the moral weight of survival at someone else's expense. The sergeant stepped closer to the civilian. "Name," he said, voice like gravel. The man swallowed, eyes darting to Tommy and me, searching for some sign of fairness, some indication that the world still held it. But fairness had left this valley hours ago, maybe days ago. I held the watch tightly. Tick, tick. The sound mingled with the muffled cries of men outside, the creak of floorboards, the low hum of fear. And in that sound, I realized the truth that I've never admitted. I had chosen a path that might have spared my life, maybe even Tommy's, but it could have damned someone else. I don't know if it was the rain or the mud, or the hours of marching that had frayed my nerves. But I felt a sudden, overwhelming nausea at the thought that the chain of small, secret choices could culminate in irrevocable harm. That the line between right and wrong had blurred long before we even crossed the threshold of that farmhouse. And then, just as we were about to leave the room, the civilian spoke, quietly, almost whispering, "Please, don't let him hurt us." His eyes locked on mine for a heartbeat longer than any moment in that war should allow. I knew what he meant, but the sergeant had already made a choice that morning. And so had I. I didn't know what I would do next. I didn't know if I could do the right thing. I only knew the watch ticked, and time was running out. For him. For us. For the truth I could never take back. The room smelled of wet wood, dust, and fear. That smell stuck with me, clinging to the back of my throat as we moved the civilian toward the center of the house. Tommy's eyes never left mine. He seemed to sense the storm inside me, even without words. I wanted to tell him everything, about the hesitation, the deviation, the step to the left, but I couldn't, not yet. Some things, I realized, weren't meant to be spoken until the consequences were visible. The sergeant barked instructions, moving the rest of the patrol to secure the perimeter. I followed mechanically, gripping the watch in my hand, feeling its cold weight as though it could remind me what mattered. I don't know why I kept it with me, except that it had become a witness, a small anchor to the world that made sense before choices became so heavy. In the corner of the room, the civilian man shivered. He wasn't defiant, just frightened. I caught him staring at my boots, muddy and worn, and I understood that he could see more than my uniform. He could see the hesitation. He could see the human part of me that had faltered, that had questioned orders, that had tried to step aside and stay safe. We swept the room slowly. Nothing extraordinary. A half-empty cupboard, a knocked-over chair, a curtain swaying in the morning breeze through a cracked window. And yet, every small detail seemed magnified. Each object a silent witness to the decisions that had brought us here. I realized that war wasn't just about who survived the gunfire. It was about the small, quiet choices that never made it into the reports. The tiny deviations that shifted outcomes in ways no one could measure. Tommy whispered again, "Riley, what do we do?" His voice trembled slightly. Though he tried to hide it, I swallowed, feeling the weight of my secret pressing down like the muddy hills outside. I wanted to tell him to say, "I slowed us down. I changed the approach. Maybe we're here because of me." But the words wouldn't come. Not then. Not to him. Not even to myself, fully. The sergeant's shadow fell over us, and I felt the undeniable pull of authority pressing down. Obey. Dot. Move. One. Act. Tau. And I obeyed. But each step carried a question. Were we protecting the civilian, or simply following orders that could lead to harm? I kept the watch in my hand, winding it slowly, listening to the tick as if it could offer guidance. It didn't. Then, the civilian moved slightly. Just a small shift, the kind anyone would dismiss. But I saw it clearly. His eyes, darting toward the door, calculating escape, weighing risk. In that moment, I realized that the hesitation that had felt small, almost invisible, was part of what put him in this position. My caution, my silence, my private fear had consequences, real, living consequences. The sergeant barked a command, and my body moved before my mind caught up. Tommy was beside me, and I felt the unspoken tension between us. We had survived Normandy together. We had survived hills and mud and cold. But this moral uncertainty was something that didn't have a pattern or a training drill. It didn't have a solution. The farmhouse seemed to close in around me. Every floorboard, every shadow, every shiver of the civilian man reminded me that a chain of tiny choices had led to this. And I kept thinking, over and over. I didn't understand what that choice would cost until it was already unfolding. By the time we finished the sweep, I realized the house was silent again, but the tension hadn't lifted. The sergeant nodded, satisfied with the perimeter, and I felt Tommy release a breath he hadn't known he was holding. I too breathed, but it was shallow, uneasy. The watch ticked relentlessly, and I knew it would remember what I had not said. Something had started that morning, in that drizzle, in that hesitant step, and it was far from over. The real reckoning, what we had unleashed, what I had set in motion, was still ahead, and I didn't know if I could face it. The patrol moved back toward the ridge, the farmhouse shrinking behind us into the haze of morning mist. The air was damp and heavy, and the mud clung to our boots like the weight of what had just happened. I kept the watch in my palm, winding it over and over, the click of the gears oddly comforting. It marked time, yes, but it also marked the part of me that had faltered, the hesitation that had begun this chain of events. Tommy fell in step beside me, shoulders hunched, face tight with thought. We didn't speak at first. Silence had become our language, heavier than words. I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, but I didn't know how to frame what I had done, or not done. Some choices, I realized, aren't meant to be explained in conversation. They're only measured in consequences, and we were just beginning to see those. When we reached the ridge, the sergeant stopped us. He barked orders, eyes scanning the valley for any sign of movement, any hint of counterattack. The young soldier who had stumbled earlier was bleeding from a scratch. Mud streaked across his face, but otherwise unhurt. I exhaled slowly, though relief was shallow. It didn't erase the gnawing fear that the minor deviations, the hesitation, the step left, the split-second pause, had changed more than I could measure. Tommy finally spoke. "Riley, you think it mattered?" His question was quiet, almost lost to the wind. I kept my eyes on the valley below, the watch heavy in my hand, ticking away with unrelenting precision. I didn't answer. How could I? Every instinct told me to obey, to move, to survive. Yet every thought clawed at the truth I was hiding. A distant gunshot cracked across the valley, not close, but close enough to remind us that danger lingered, even when orders were complete. And I felt the first real tremor of guilt, not for my own safety, not for Tommy's, but for the civilian we had left behind. That hesitation, the choice I had made quietly, was like a shadow stretching far beyond us. I didn't know what it had caused, who had been endangered, who had been spared, only that the consequences would eventually reach us, one way or another. We paused to rest briefly under a lone pine, mud seeping through our uniforms. Tommy looked at me, hand brushing against mine in a small, unspoken gesture. A friend's reassurance, yes, but also a mirror. He could sense the weight of my secret, and I could sense his worry, not just for the war, but for the choices we'd made, choices no manual had prepared us for. I held the watch again, pressing it to my chest. Tick. It was a rhythm I clung to, a tether to something beyond the mud and fear, beyond the sergeant's orders and the patrol's movements. It was a reminder that time moves forward whether we act or hesitate, whether we do right or wrong. And yet, that day, I realized how easily the wrong act, or lack of act, could shape the lives of men, civilians, friends, and strangers alike. As we started moving again, the valley below quiet except for the whisper of wind through the grass, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder at the farmhouse. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, and it looked empty now, like the world had wiped clean the traces of our intrusion. But I knew better. I knew that the echoes of that morning, the hesitation, the deviation, the fear, would linger. They always linger, and I couldn't escape the knowledge that my choice had been small, almost invisible. Yet it had set events in motion that I could neither undo nor fully understand. Tommy stayed close, as he always did, and I felt the comfort of that bond. But comfort was fragile, and the tension in my chest reminded me this story was far from over. I had taken a path I still couldn't justify, and the consequences were waiting, patient and inevitable, just over the next ridge. By late afternoon, the ridge offered little comfort. The sun, low and weak behind a blanket of clouds, cast the valley in gray light. Our patrol had settled near a shallow creek, trying to clean mud from uniforms and boots, though the cold made it pointless. I kept the watch in my palm, winding it slowly, listening to the tick as if it could remind me who I was or who I had failed to be. Tommy sat beside me, face streaked with mud and exhaustion. He didn't speak at first, just stared at the creek water swirling over stones. I wanted to tell him about the hesitation, the deviation from orders that had haunted the morning, but words felt dangerous. Not to the sergeant, not to the others, but to ourselves. Once said, the secret can't be unsaid, and some truths, I realized, way heavier when voiced. The sergeant came over, inspecting the perimeter. His gaze lingered briefly on the farmhouse in the distance. "Quiet day," he said, tone flat. But I could hear something beneath the words. Suspicion. Orders had been followed, but he sensed the minor deviations. The way men hesitated. The way I lingered at the back. I kept winding the watch, ticking away the minutes, as if time itself could absolve me. It didn't. Tommy finally spoke, voice low. "Riley, you think anyone noticed?" He didn't clarify. Not the civilian, not the sergeant, not the men who'd stumbled along the ridge. I understood the question immediately. I didn't answer. I didn't want to. Some things, once set in motion, are best left in the mind, gnawing quietly. The creek murmured, cold and indifferent, and then a sound that froze me. A shout from the valley, not close, but urgent, raw. My stomach clenched. We had left the farmhouse behind, thinking the mission done. But the consequences, I realized with a chill, were catching up. I could see the civilian man in my mind, the way he had trembled, the way his eyes had searched for mercy that day. I had no idea what was coming next, but I knew it wouldn't be good. Tommy touched my arm. "Riley, you were sweating." I wiped my palm on my jacket, trying to hide the shaking. Tick-tick. The watch's rhythm seemed louder now, marking each heartbeat, each faltering choice. I realized the minor hesitation that had seemed inconsequential that morning had grown into something much larger, something that might follow us for the rest of the war. The sergeant signaled that it was time to move. We gathered our gear, boots squelching in mud, bodies stiff from the hours. And as we trudged along the ridge, I kept the watch close, as if holding it could protect me from the truth. But the truth had a way of slipping through the cracks, and I could feel it approaching like the shadow of the hills themselves. I glanced at Tommy. He was quiet, vigilant, unaware, or pretending unaware, of the chain of choices we'd set in motion. And I understood that day, in the cold gray light, that survival wasn't about heroics or bravery. It was about decisions, small and quiet, that could ripple outward in ways no one could see. I had made one such decision, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to live with its consequences. The valley ahead looked empty, peaceful even, but I knew better. I could feel the weight of the morning pressing down on me. That hesitation, that step to the left, that secret decision, it was still alive, waiting, and I was walking straight toward it, whether I wanted to or not. Night had fallen by the time we returned to the ridge. The stars were dim behind a veil of clouds, and the valley below was shadowed and still. I kept the watch in my hand, its ticking the only companion in the quiet that had replaced the day's chaos. Tommy was beside me, silent, his breathing even, as if the war hadn't reached him in the same way it had me. But I knew better. The war didn't spare anyone. It simply buried what it didn't destroy. We had left the farmhouse that morning, thinking the worst was behind us. But the consequences had not stayed behind. They had followed. The civilian man, his name, which I learned later from the sergeant, was Paolo, was taken by the Germans the next week. He was accused of collaborating, though what he had really done was survive. I'll never know if my hesitation, my step to the left, the moment I chose caution over action, had delayed us enough for them to find him. I like to think it wasn't my fault. But the truth sits heavy like wet mud in my chest. Tommy and I never spoke of it. We didn't have to. The silence between us became a language of its own. I kept the watch, winding it over the years, letting it mark the passage of time and the weight of what had been done. I still remember the way Paolo's eyes searched mine in that kitchen, pleading for mercy, for a choice that I had the power to make, or fail to make, and I didn't act, not fully. I chose the path that kept me alive, that kept Tommy alive, but left someone else exposed. I've carried that secret for decades. I carried it through marriage, through children, through every quiet evening when the world seemed safe. The watch ticks still, a reminder that time moves forward, but decisions do not. They echo, they linger. And that morning in northern Italy, the step I took, or didn't take, echoed further than I could ever comprehend. Would you have done differently? I ask myself that constantly. Would you have risked yourself for a stranger whose fate was uncertain, whose life seemed so small compared to survival, compared to orders, compared to fear? I cannot answer, not honestly. The best I can do is admit it now. In this quiet confession, decades too late. Tommy is gone now, as are most of the men who were with me that spring. The sergeant, the patrol, the ridge itself, they exist in memory only, and I remain, alone with the watch, alone with the chain of decisions I can never undo. The rain, the mud, the farmhouse, Paolo's eyes, they visit me still. Every tick of the watch is a reminder. I survived, yes, but at what cost? I never wrote about it before. I never told anyone, but time is running out. This confession, unsigned, anonymous, is the closest I will come to admitting the truth. Not for absolution, not for praise, only so that someone, somewhere, might understand that the small choices, the hesitation, the self-preservation, the failure to act, can carry consequences far heavier than any bullet. And so I leave it here, with the watch ticking in my hand, with the valley and the farmhouse and Paolo alive in memory, a reminder that war is not just a series of battles, but a chain of quiet, morally uncertain choices. I cannot change what happened, but I can finally speak it, even if no one ever reads it. The watch ticks. I listen, I remember, and I wait for time to end.